I think it's always good to say that the peoples of Africa were the mothers and fathers of civilization, that we created civilization along the Nile Valley, as evidenced by our architecture such as pyramids and our discovery of mathematics and medicine, etc. And for thousands of years, we were self-reliant and independent. And it's important to establish that. I mean, we had empires in North Africa, we had the Sudanic empires in West Africa, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, had Monomotapa in Southern Africa, and empires in, like in South Africa. They were more developed than what was happening in Europe on or about the same time. And it's very, very important to establish that. Unfortunately, for us, the way that slavery was carried out, we were stripped of the knowledge of self and kind. We were stripped of our culture. And we are very peculiar people in that sense, because slavery had taken place in the ancient times and in the medieval time. But rarely would the slave master actually strip the people of their language and their culture. And we were stripped of that because I guess those that enslaved us knew our civilization was higher than theirs, and they didn't want us to know that we were great people at a point. So they wanted to completely subjugate us to the level of chattel. So in terms of Africans in the Americas, it's important for all of us to know that our people came from every aspect of the African continent. They came from Ethiopia, they came from Nigeria, Southern Africa, Central Africa.
So there's no
North
just
Africa.
one place that black people in the Americas generally came from?
Well, most historians, and that's your field, would say West Africa. But our people came from other parts of Africa, and especially in the latter days of the slave trade. And they were dispersed throughout the diaspora in North America, well, initially in the Caribbean. That was the place where the seasoning took place. That was the place where they stripped us of our culture, our names, our religion. And also they were dispersed through South America. And at this point, the largest population of people of African descent in the Western world is in Brazil. There are more African people in Brazil than you have in the United States, or in the whole of the Caribbean. You know, talking about 150 million people of African descent right there
and so,
in Brazil.
So Doctor, let me interrupt here. And so what you're saying is that there is some kind of close connection, for the benefit of our audience this morning, between the Africans who are in South America and the Africans who are in North America. Expand upon that, William.
Yes, and recognizing that fact, that we have Africans on the continent and Africans in diaspora in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. That's why we chose to name our department Africana Studies, symbolizing that Pan-African spirit, accounting for Africans in terms of the African world community, rather than identifying ourselves as Afro-American or Black studies, which would only limit us to our experience in North America.
And so it's much broader than just the United States.
International in scope and Pan-African in spirit.
I'm sorry to have interrupted.
No, I think it's very important. Of course, there are certain things I'm sure you're aware of that our audience want to hear, and I'm glad you made that interruption.
You know, when we look at the African experience in North America, what are some of the things that you can say that perhaps made that experience in North America perhaps different from that experience in South America? And if there indeed were any differences in experiences, what are some of the things that you might be able to point out from those experiences?
Well, the most obvious thing is that we had different colonial masters. In Brazil, they were dominated by the Portuguese. In a place like Haiti or Cuba was the Spanish. And in some were, like in Martinique, they were dominated by the French. So the difference of the European cultures provided a different environment and a different type of setting. Another point, too, was the Anglo-Saxons, the British, had a very strict policy of racial separation. The French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese allowed the people to assimilate more into the culture. And that's why a language like Creole developed. And because it was a closer contact with the culture, we were totally pushed away from the culture and at the same time separated from our own culture. So in the North American experience, we were like strangers in a strange land, not knowing our own culture, but at the same time being pushed away from European culture. Only taught the language of command. In fact, we were put in such darkness that for many years it was illegal for a slave to be able to read and write. So they'd make sure you wouldn't learn anything about your past or your present, and only learn a language through the oral tradition and through the language of command, which was English.
You know, we're going to talk on this show later on about Africans and the American Constitution from that
Right.
perspective. And let's sort of have you to sort of prepare our audience for that kind of discussion by giving us some information from the perspective of the Africana Studies Department dealing with the institution of slavery, you know, whatever you wish to inform our audience, because all of us know about slavery. Exactly. But very few of us understand exactly what slavery was all about, the scope of slavery and those involved. I think you've already indicated that the Europeans were involved in it. Let's look at the, excuse me, the international slave trade and that kind of information to sort of give us a broader view of that institution.
Yes. Well, the thing we start with, we realize that feudalism existed in Europe before slavery. So in a certain way, the Europeans were practicing semi-slavery on each other. Okay, and in the fact, too, that they established the 13 colonies here, the whites that came from Europe were indentured servants. So they were in a type of servitude as well. And if you understand the fact that slavery as an institution was a crime against humanity, Europeans enslaved each other first. And then when they started enslaving us, they didn't really have any feeling, because they didn't have any feeling for other Europeans that they enslaved and put in the dungeons and so forth in Europe. So that's the key thing, to realize that it was a matter of human bondage. It was a matter of the human condition, of the human population being enslaved. Now again, I get back to the fact, the worst thing about slavery for us is that we were dislocated from our gods, our traditional gods, our traditional religions. We were dislocated from our names. So to this very day, we can't, if I look at you or you look at me, I might have some of the phenotypical traits of a Yoruba or an Ashanti or an Igbo or Pygmy, but we couldn't really say that I'm a Yoruba or that you're an Igbo. But